Between a place that felt safe in the rear and a skyline turned to night, a black column of smoke shot up 100 meters, 660,000 liters of fuel gone in a sea of fire. And the creepiest part? That strike was carried out by drones cheaper than your laptop. 35 kilometers, a distance every military manual used to call out of reach. Today, we are going to unpack exactly how a small team of Ukrainian drone pilots shattered the idea of a safe rear area. You are about to see the art of fooling radar, the raw business of electronic warfare, and a strategic lesson that could rewrite a battlefield. This was a deliberate attack. 4 FPV, first-person view, drones, flown by Ukraine's Ronin unit, reached and struck a Russian fuel train roughly 35 kilometers inside enemy-held territory. The result, roughly 660,000 liters of diesel and aviation fuel went up in flames, the blaze burned for nearly 6 hours, and the rail line was out of service for at least 72 hours. The cost of the 4 attacking drones? About $12,000. The estimated damage to fuel and infrastructure? Millions of dollars. That cost-to-effect ratio is exactly why this story deserves close analysis. Key players in the operation included Ronin, the strike unit, experienced FPV pilots, Kabul 9, also written KB Bell 9, the intelligence unit tracking the train's schedule and its tanker configuration, Alpha, the signals intelligence team monitoring Russian communications, and the State Special Communications Service, counter-jamming specialists able to punch holes through enemy interference. On the Russian side, multiple systems were deployed. Verba, a man-portable air defense system, R330Z, a truck-mounted jammer, Kasuka 4, a signal detector for drone control links, Panzer S1, an air defense system, and Pole 21, a jammer mounted on the train itself. Also used were swarms of cheap decoy drones, bait units costing only a few $100s each to fool radars and burn through missile magazines. Racing drones usually operate effectively at around 3 kilometers. 35 kilometers is a different world. The limit is not just batteries or speed, it is communications, control, and video latency. To pull off this strike, Ukraine used analog video transmission in the 5.8 to 8 gigahertz bands and Oyeni, or the critical advantage, zero latency. Digital systems are easier to extend, but they introduce roughly 200 milliseconds of delay. At 80 kilometers per hour, that delay can mean being off target by about 5 meters. When you are trying to hit a small fuel tanker on a moving train, that margin is fatal. So Ukraine accepted the complexity of analog and the need for fragile relay infrastructure in order to keep latency effectively at zero. Ukraine's answer was a repeater chain. Relay drones spaced every few kilometers to carry analog video and control signals beyond normal range. The primary repeater hovered at about 500 meters for optimal propagation. Backups flew lower, one at about 200 meters, harder to detect, and an ultra-low one at about 100 meters as a last resort. Repeaters were spaced roughly 2 kilometers apart so that a single missile could not knock out the whole chain, but repeaters are vulnerable. In this mission, a 500-meter primary was struck by a Verba operator, severing the lead drone's link. Those next few seconds were decisive for the mission. Backups had to jump into place, accept much weaker signal strength, and keep the operation alive. When the attack drones entered the R330Z's coverage, a 15-kilometer bubble of noise from a truck-mounted jammer, their video feed collapsed into static. The counter was frequency hopping, sweeping through about 40 channels per second to find tiny gaps the jammer does not cover. Those gaps exist only for milliseconds. Ukraine did not hop randomly. They followed tested patterns, a few hops on common bands to confuse the jammer, then a rapid jump into a less watched frequency for a 2-second clear window, enough to press forward. When that was not enough, they activated counter-electronic warfare, a powerful directional transmission that literally burns a hole through the jamming, creating a roughly 30-second window of usable signal. That window is a bold trade-off. When counter-electronic warfare is on, Ukraine's position lights up on every Russian detection system like a lighthouse. But they had done the math. Russian artillery reaction time to initial detection averaged about 45 seconds. A 30-second clean window was just long enough to punch through 8 to 10 kilometers of heavily jammed airspace, then shut down and relocate. Trial runs had validated the timing, aggressive but survivable. When GNSS satellite navigation is spoofed or nullified, the drones cannot rely on digital navigation. Pilots must fly visually through grainy, degraded screens. They use rail lines, rivers, and power lines as high-contrast highways. They count to 15, slight right, count to 10, pull up for the power lines. These are military-style procedures drilled in hundreds of hours of simulation. A 1 or 2 second mistake can mean detection, a collision with a power line, or worse. To blunt the Panzer S1, decoys were launched, cheap drones fitted with corner reflectors so they appear large on radar. Faced with multiple radar contacts, Russian operators had to choose: expend missiles on every contact or risk missing true threats. In this engagement, some decoys worked as intended, forcing Panzer to waste 8 of 12 missiles. With its magazines depleted and a reload time approaching about 20 minutes, Panzer's effectiveness was critically reduced, and the real attack drones gained precious survivability. The next tactic was brutal and precise. Descend to about 10 meters, skimming the ground so radar cannot separate the drone from ground clutter. Panzer S1 struggles below roughly 15 meters, so flying low is an effective escape, but the hazards multiply. Wires, trees, birds, all deadly at 80 kilometers per hour. Ronin pilots trained hundreds of hours in simulators to fly blind for 30 seconds, memorizing every pole, every clearing. As the drones closed, tension peaked. The train tried to accelerate from 40 to 45 kilometers per hour, lowering hit probability. Pilots kept counting, clung to the rails. At about 500 meters, the lead drone struck. Its warhead, an RPG-7-shaped charge as described in the transcript, penetrated the tank, igniting roughly 60,000 liters of fuel and triggering an immediate catastrophic fire. 30 seconds later, the second drone impacted the fourth car. The third and fourth followed through choking smoke. In the end, all 11 tankers were ablaze, 660,000 liters burning. A plume of black smoke 100 meters high, heat warping the rails and cracking concrete ties. Immediate consequences. The material fallout is obvious. The rail line was unusable for at least 72 hours. Storage was destroyed, and losses ran into the millions. But the psychological impact is larger. A strike 35 kilometers inside rear areas shatters the assumption of safe logistics. If supply lines are not secure at that distance, military planners must rethink every route. 4 drones costing roughly $12,000 caused roughly $3 million of damage to fuel and infrastructure. That math is stark. Inexpensive systems can inflict outsized strategic damage. Welcome to the economics of drone warfare. Cold numbers hide real lives, but the lessons are clear. Electronic warfare dominates outcomes. Control the spectrum, and you control the fight. Redundancy matters. Repeater chains and backups are mission critical. Decoys are cheap and devastating. Forcing an opponent to waste expensive missiles is a force multiplier. Human skill still wins in the black screen scenarios. Pilot training and instincts outrank many high-end systems, and cost-effectiveness reshapes strategy. Small, cheap strikes against logistics force expensive defensive responses. A human perspective. Numbers are clinical, but behind them are people scrambling. At the receiving terminal, the normal rhythm is gone. Smoke, the stench of burning fuel, engines revving amid shouted orders. Dock workers in hard hats, hands stained with oil, try to reconnect scorched conveyors. Repair crews unroll hoses, stretch booms, drag out backup pumps. A reserve storage depot is leveled. Hundreds of tons of fuel turn to ash. Over the next 72 hours, trucks detour on longer routes. Transport costs spike. Workers are put on extended shifts, and transport contracts are put on hold. For communities in the rear, this is not a line item on a briefing slide. It is the question of whether there will be enough fuel to take a child to school or money to cover the next month's rent. A recent historical lesson. The closest cautionary tale is the 14th of September, 2019, attack on Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia, which temporarily cut Saudi output by about 5.5 to 5.7 million barrels per day and sent oil prices spiking worldwide. Today's attack is smaller in scale, 660,000 liters and a 72-hour interdiction, but it shares the same logic. Hit energy infrastructure, and the economic and military ripple effects are immediate. The difference is only scale, not essence. A single depot burning or one rail corridor cut sends shockwaves through supply chains, drives up costs, forces defense budgets to shift, and hits people at home. The lesson is blunt. Protecting logistics is not an optional expense. It is the front line of both combat power and economic stability. If you thought logistics can wait, think again. A handful of cheap drones can rewrite a nation's supply calculus. Long-term strategic implications: if today's reach was 35 kilometers, tomorrow it could be 50, even 100. That means no logistics node can be assumed secure. Forces must redesign supply networks, disperse stockpiles, mask and harden radio frequency signatures, integrate defensive electronic warfare, and invest in forward detection and countermeasures. Modern warfare is no longer just tanks versus tanks. It is a war for the spectrum, for deception, and for the ability to operate human crews under chaotic, jammed conditions. 4 drones, a few $1,000s, and a sophisticated plan turned a logistics artery into ash. If you found this analysis valuable, hit like and subscribe so we can keep unpacking the technologies reshaping modern warfare. Tell us in the comments, what is the best way to protect logistics? Dispersal, radio frequency masking, layered air defenses, or something else? I will collect ideas and make a follow-up deep dive. See you next time.